Welcome to this conversation about church, social enterprise, and taxation. My name is Mark Elsden, and I'm a co-founder with Rooted Good. Rooted Good is an organization that serves leaders around in the church and congregations around issues of social enterprise, the alignment of money and mission, and just trying to move the church forward in the times that we're in currently. One of the things that we have discovered is that many congregations are exploring using their property and buildings for revenue generating components. So sort of different than the taking offerings in an offering plate model that has been the staple of church financing for many, many years. This might take the form of renting out space in a church. It might take the form of renting a parking lot, or putting a cell phone tower on the top of a building, or engaging in some sort of social enterprise, kind of a social business, so to speak, out of the church. And these are all really exciting, promising ways for the church to serve their neighborhood and to serve the people that they're trying to engage with. But they do come with some questions around taxation, around what does it mean for tax exempt status? What does it mean with regard to federal income tax, state tax, property tax, sales tax, and so on and so forth? So today we're going to have a conversation with some experts in this space, just to talk about some of the ideas here on a very introductory level. So this is not going to answer every question you might have about taxation. And this is certainly not meant to be construed as legal advice or formal accounting advice. It's very important for you, before engaging in any sort of revenue generating activity, to consult legal and accounting expertise in your own area and confirm the implications of that on your organization. So this is meant to be an introduction to these ideas, and to just build some capacity and confidence to asking the right questions and talking about it. So with that introduction, I'd like to ask each of our folks to just briefly share who they are and what they do in their work, and then we'll get into this conversation. I'll start with Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Kimmel, and I'm the General Counsel for the United Church of Christ. And in that capacity, I advise the denominational setting as well as our regional conferences and assist churches with all kinds of issues.
Thanks, Heather. How about Susan? You want to chime in?
Absolutely. I'm Susan Mitchell. I'm the Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives for Church Building and Loan Fund with the United Church of Christ. And I work with churches of various denominations across the country who are considering or in the process of repurposing their property and facilities or engaging in plans for a development project.
Thank you, Susan. Patrick.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Dugan. I serve as Executive Director of the United Church of Christ Church Building and Loan Fund. And the fund provides United Church of Christ congregations and other Christian organizations with real estate financing, operational resources, and expertise to build stable, thriving communities that advance the gospel mission. And I'm glad to be here for this conversation.
Thanks, Patrick. And finally, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda Vanetta. I am a senior manager with Wagner CPAs. We are a CPA and consulting firm. I'm a not-for-profit tax expert. I've practiced in 990s and tax consulting around being and staying exempt for the last dozen years.
Good. Well, we have a good team here, so we should be able to have some good conversation about this. I'd like to just start by kind of posing the question that I've gotten quite often, and that is a congregation is thinking about engaging in some sort of revenue generating activity, but they quickly become nervous about it because they're afraid that it's going to threaten their tax exempt status with the IRS, or they're going to end up paying huge tax bills. Sometimes I've heard this, a church board gets into this discussion and somebody says, no, we can't do that because, taxes or tax exempt status. What do you say to that? What would you say to a church that's worried about that?
Well, I would say as a church, you are not required to actually file any formal tax return on an annual basis. with the IRS, like most exempt organizations that have their exemption under, as a 501c3 organization. However, when you do participate in activities that are outside of your mission, that could have a commerciality, what we call the commerciality doctrine, where you could possibly be competing with a for-profit business and the kind of money you're raising, then there is some tax issues that you can run into. So while a church would never be required to file a Form 990 unless they would voluntarily choose to do so, they could potentially have to file the federal Form 990T, which is where you report your unrelated business income. And you would then be subject to 21% taxation under the current code. That could change at any time with any legislation that comes out, but currently the corporate tax rate is 21%. And then there likely is some state also taxation issues that would come into play depending on where you are located. But it does not kind of put your tax exempt status in jeopardy unless you were to have some kind of massive new business that just is generating so much in profit that then it could potentially be an issue.
I would say that, we should start from the thought, right? Let's try something new and it's going to generate revenue. That's the kind of thinking that we need to cultivate in churches, not squash. Because in this season that we're in, churches need to develop more revenue streams. And the other thing I love that Amanda said, if it's outside of your mission, and I think, churches need to be clear about what their mission is, revisiting it regularly so that it's inclusive of the range of how they face the world and offer whatever they offer to the world. And then as they come up with these ideas and it's not for revenue generation necessarily alone, it might be that it's a missional activity that generates revenue. And so as you write about it, as you plan for it, as you have meetings around it, you want to make sure that all of that information talks about how it's advancing your mission. And that it's really explicit in a lot of places. So down the road, maybe this thing grows from $10 a month to $1,000 a month to $100,000. You have said all along, this is part of our mission. It aligns with our mission. And the third thing, and I'll leave it alone, is if you get into a situation where you do, have an excessive amount of unrelated business income, then you just pay the tax. It's okay. It means you've made so much money that the government is looking at you to share some with the rest of society. So I think we should stop sort of putting up that wall of paying tax as a horrible thing that that the church could be doing, and understand it as part of possibly part of expanding and growing.
I would agree with that. And as you said in the beginning, Mark, I'm often asked those type of questions as we work with churches who are beginning or initiating that process of developing ministries that may produce additional streams of income. And our recommendations as a part of our process is that they seek a tax attorney first. As part of what we require them to do is to seek a tax attorney first, and preferably one that is not a member of the congregation.
So, Susan, I agree with that 100%. And I think what's really important is for churches not to make assumptions about what they are required or what they're not required to do until they get some professional advice on the sort of the enterprise that they're undertaking, because it may not put them in a situation where they have to pay taxes. And I found that there's a lot of misinformation out there about what will jeopardize your tax exempt status with the IRS. So the first thing to do is to seek some expert advice on what's actually going to happen here.
And I think the other important thing to say is as you know, Patrick said, even if you find out you have an unrelated business income source and you have to pay tax on it, you still are are generating unrestricted funds for your.
Yes.
A lot of times, the 21% you pay
Yes.
is just a drop in the bucket compared to what you are going to make. And lots of times, I do have organizations ask how much is too much. And unfortunately, the IRS is not clear on that answer. They like to leave a lot of gray area organizations. So an agent could possibly come in and, depending on their analysis, can kind of decide how much is too much. But the general kind of industry rule that we look at is if you're starting to have your unrelated business income sources creep up to about 10% of the revenue that you're earning within your organization, you might want to consider doing something else with that money. What I mean by doing something else with that money is you don't have to stop having that revenue source be generated, but maybe you just want to break it into its own corporation or its own partnership that then would be a separate legal entity from the church entity itself. So there is so many solutions when it comes to these different revenue sources that you really should talk to a professional, because just passing up on all of that unrestricted funding would be, quite frankly, foolish at the end of the day if you have an opportunity to earn that revenue.
You sort of touched on unrelated business income, which suggests that there might be related business income or some or mission aligned income or something along those lines. Does anyone want to speak to that distinction a little bit? We sort of touched on it. Patrick started there, but how does that play into some of these questions, and particularly as it relates to sort of tax exempt status, which I think is often a fear, beyond even paying the taxes. Are we going to suddenly become not an even exempt organization, no longer a nonprofit because we're doing too much of X, Y, or Z? Are there ways for churches to engage in mission-aligned activity that generates significant revenue, but that's still, core to their mission, and therefore not unrelated, but actually related income?
I think first and foremost, you have to define what your mission is. And what I like to encourage organizations to think about is you don't want your mission to be overly restrictive as to what you can do. So in the case of a church, I would always say that obviously you are at the core a religious organization, but you're also, as part of a religious organization, set to also serve your community. And so I think by including just some really general language at the end of mission, sometimes you open yourself up to generating some revenue that could be related, where if you were so constrictive with your mission as to just saying it's a religious organization, might leave some revenue in that unrelated bucket. Because inherently in the IRS code, there's 3 different sources of revenue that you could earn. The first one's related, so it aligns with your mission. The second would be an excluded revenue source. That's stuff like interest, capital gains and losses, rental income that is not debt financed, royalties coming into your organization. And then the third bucket is unrelated. So every source of revenue an organization earns has to fit into one of those 3 buckets. But let's say you could rent out your facility to some community groups, and you say that your mission is to be a religious organization, but also to serve your community. If you're renting out to then community organizations, now you've made that revenue mission aligned. You're serving your community by allowing your facility to be open for their use.
So what are the different types of taxes churches should be aware of? Just someone want to say a word about that? I mean, we talked about kind of unrelated business income, which is a federal income tax. What about other kinds of taxes?
So I think one of the kinds of taxes that churches really need to be aware of are property taxes, because that can, and their property tax exemption, which can come into play when you're engaging in an enterprise that might not be within that property tax exemption, however your state defines it. And so that's one of the things that churches need to pay attention to when they're getting ready to engage in in an endeavor, a money-making endeavor, essentially.
And property taxation, in my experience, is very, very localized. So very state-based. And then even the application of it is very localized to the application of state law is at the whim sometimes of a city assessor or of a municipality, and maybe applied differently even in this different cities in the same state.
It certainly seems that that's the way it's going. And we've even seen changes in the past decade of how tax assessors have applied that religious exemption to churches who are doing different things with their property. That maybe they were doing the same things for the past several decades, and all of a sudden it's now not within that religious exemption anymore. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
I also think it's important that churches stay on top of the required filings, usually every year. I'm in New York. The county requires you to the church to every year state that they're a church and that they're still at the same location, that property is still being used as a church. But there are also new uses that municipalities are coming up with that are being taxed for. And oftentimes, because, it's new, churches assume that, we don't have to worry about it. But I think given the fact that local governments are pressed for tax revenue, they're going to be figuring out new ways to pay for the cost of government. And sometimes it requires us as churches and church leaders to be mindful of the new, for example, sewer tax, or a change in the way they are assessing taxes. So we have to be alert and aware that, we're part of the society we live in. And when we get a notice in the mail from the municipality about certain changes in taxation or just about anything, we should be on top of it. And I say that because we every year we run into churches that get in trouble because they didn't file this document or they didn't pay attention to this notice from the government. So it's something to be on top of.
I think what you just said, Patrick, just highlights the importance of churches having a tax attorney outside of the membership to advise them and keep them on point for completing those kinds of documents, and then helping them to understand the new rules and new laws as they change from year to year, and also to assist them when they do engage in other kinds of projects.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way in which it feels quite complicated. There's all these different layers. There's, federal income tax. There's state income tax, often depends on the state. There's a state sales tax, actually, which is different again, right? So if you're selling something, you perhaps, depending on what it is, have to pay sales tax on that. You can also purchase things as a tax exempt organization. So there's that kind of element of it. And then property tax, which might be the most complicated of all in some ways because it is so localized. So having expert help, and sometimes people aren't experts in all of those either. You might actually need a couple different folks in different areas. But I think, one of the things that I've observed is that we sometimes shortchange that part of it, right? So if we're going to engage in a new venture that's going to generate revenue, well, we got to budget some money to hire people to help.
Correct.
And it doesn't always take a whole lot, actually. It might be a few hours of time, or a few hours once, a couple times a year to assist with some things. So it's not like it's a massive cost, but spending a few $1,000s a year can really save a huge headache. Especially if we're going to get into some significant revenue activity.
The really important thing is make sure you contact that professional before you start the activity, not after you commence the activity where it's doing damage control.
That's a
you know
great
what? It's only complicated in the beginning, right? And you only have to do it once. Maybe you have to go back, but you when you're going to start, you need to get a lot of information, and then you figure it out and you go ahead. So we make it more complicated perhaps than it is. So
That's a great point, is that you establish all this stuff in the beginning and then it's like smooth sailing. So just something for thought here is that compliance is ongoing, but often lay leadership is not. And so there needs to be transition planning when you do have a revenue generating activity at a church, so that folks are aware of what needs to be, what you need to keep up with, what you need to continue, so that those balls don't get dropped when every other year your moderator and your church council roll over and people are kind of like, wait, what happened here? What, do we have good notes on this? Can we go back and talk to some of these folks? So just be aware that compliance is ongoing, but leadership often is transitions pretty quickly in the church.
What you're highlighting there is that on the front end, there's a way in which designing the activity is really important to do in collaboration or in understanding, with some attorney and accounting help. But once it's set up, and there's often many ways to do it, to design it, to sort of make that happen, right? And so subtle shifts or other changes can make something that might not have worked well work well. But that's all got to be done on the front end. And then once that's going and rolling, then there's this compliance element, which is often not that complicated, actually, but does require somebody to make sure it's happening, right? So that it doesn't just get dropped and, oh, that form came in the mail for 3 years in a row and we did nothing about it. And now suddenly, right? So those are two sort of somewhat distinct things, but a lot of it is on the front end, and setting it up right on the front end can make a huge difference.
That's true.
So what about some mistakes you've seen people make? A few have been sort of named here, but like, give me some examples, or what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen churches make, and how can they avoid them?
Well, the biggest mistake is to let the T word stop you from planning altogether. Oh my God, we might have to pay taxes.
That's true.
And it's easy to cut off creativity. But I think let's not do that. Let's look at it as, yes, we want to do something new. It's probably going to generate new revenue, and it might generate taxes. Let's clarify what we need to get. Let's get the expert help. Let's take care of it in the beginning, and then continue on with our planning for this amazing venture we want to do. I think that's very important.
So one of the big mistakes I see churches make is trying to do it themselves. Churches are experts on mission and ministry, right? No one does that like a church does. And so if churches can kind of think about it, how they might need expert help in the things that they don't know how to do well, I think they would be better off. I really hate to see churches downloading legal documents off the internet and just sort of filling them in. We're going to do this revenue generating project, but we don't have enough money to pay for tax and legal advice. That's a red flag right there.
Sometimes all it takes is a 15-minute call. I talked to somebody yesterday, a pastor in Madison, Wisconsin. Parking is really hard downtown for anyone that's ever tried to park down here. There's just not that much, a lot of street parking. So if you have a parking lot that is downtown, it is very desirable for a lot of people. And they were having a new concert venue going across the street and had been approached as to, can we use your parking lot? And saying, can we pay you for your parking lots? Which inherently is an unrelated activity to the organization. However, there are all these caveats in the tax code, right? So if you structure it where there's a third party administrator that's actually overseeing all the operation of your parking lots and just paying you rent or lease income to use that property, now we've taken what would be an unrelated income source and we've turned it into an excluded revenue source. And having was a 15-minute discussion that got us to kind of where we needed to go. We're talking about, volunteer exemptions to unrelated business income. And when you talk to a CPA, generally we're willing to answer questions in a lot of cases on the front end of working with an organization. And if we find out that you have some kind of tax filings, then we're probably going to charge you to get those tax filings taken care of. But sometimes you can get a few questions answered, especially when it's not a really large time commitment and you're not looking for some kind of formal memorandum to come out of it, you can get that for free sometimes. It's not all the time. If you find out you do have to write something more formal, you will get charged generally an hourly rate for that, but it can be very, very reasonable to kind of just have those discussions on the front end. It might only be a $200 commitment to really find out that you can generate $10,000 a year and it's going to be excluded.
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the our concerns is really changing the ethos and the thinking around when churches and ministry leaders start talking about doing different kind of projects. And that should be a part of it originally instead of an afterthought. And so part of that comes through our capacity building program. So we help them reframe how they used to do stuff into how they should be doing stuff in this time and age. And that's inclusive of all these different services that we're speaking of, and particularly a tax attorney.
So what about success stories? Can anyone tell us a story of an organization, a church that did generate revenue well, or launch a social enterprise and kind of either figured it out or muddled their way through it and got there eventually or whatever, but like tell us an example of how it can work.
Well, we have a program, the Adesse Fellows program. We're about to launch our third cohort of what we call spiritual entrepreneurs, which will make 32 or 33 that will have gone through that program when this next cohort completes. And then several of those are church-based enterprises that some of them have been very successful. One is a bakery. Another is a church that purchased a strip mall so that they could open a thrift shop. That is now an independent, and it generates something like $1 million in revenue a year. And there are others. And probably our most exciting example is St. Peter's United Church of Christ in Louisville, Kentucky, that, they have an affiliated community development corporation, nonprofit organization that, along with the church, developed a property that will wind up generating something like $1 million, $1.4 million over the next 15 years in cash, cash flow to the church, and all done with many lawyers. But there are examples out there of folks who figure it out and make it happen.
Any other examples folks have?
So I think one of the most kind of the classic example is a church that also runs a preschool program. I mean, there's definitely revenue generation there. Now, you don't really see a lot of churches opening new preschool programs. In fact, some of them are closing, but some churches are getting creative with what they do with that space once the preschool program has closed. So they're either getting revenue by leasing it out, or they're just doing something totally different with that space in terms of the use of it.
Preschools and daycare centers are a lot of churches like those, and it's important that when you decide on that you do so your research, so that you're opening it in where you are really makes a difference.
Yes.
We have a church that was looking at a preschool in Brooklyn, New York, that in a community that they call the stroller capital of the country. They have more toddlers than anybody else in the country. So all of their preschools have waiting lists. So that's a good place to do it. But you might live in a community that maybe you live right next to a 55 and over community. Not going to be as many young children. So things are that important.
This sort of a tangent off the taxes, but it's a good point, Patrick, that it's really important to think about both what is the mission purpose of a project, not just can it make money, but also is there demand for it? What is is it meeting some kind of actual need? Because just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be done or that that's the right place to do it. or that you're the right church to do it. I mean, so
That's
there's
true.
those pieces are really important as well. I mean, you can get all the legal and accounting help you want and craft some big scheme, but if nobody is actually interested in it and it's serving no real need in the community, then what's the point of doing that, right? So
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, the other need is commercial kitchens. We see a lot of congregations creating commercial kitchens that they either you rent to a young entrepreneur who's developing a business, or meal preparation organizations who are helping to provide meals for people in the community. But there are a lot of churches who have commercial kitchens, and they either rent them in a variety of different ways. So I think those are very successful, but they also have to consider the business that's flowing through them as well.
Yeah, we've got a church in Pearl City, Hawaii, tiny church that renovated their commercial kitchen, among other spaces they've renovated, and they're doing very well. They have daycare centers. It's high demand in Pearl City. And their commercial kitchen, they rent out to food trucks and folks doing their own commercial enterprises. When I was last there about 3 years ago, they had a guy who was making pickles out of, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, some kind, maybe it was pineapple rinds or something. I don't know. He made pickles,
Okay.
and he used the kitchen to pickle and store. So commercial kitchens are definitely something that churches can look at as revenue generators. And if they do well, they could have related income and unrelated business income through those.
And when you're describing activities like that, I feel like, it might not be directly related to the mission of the church. Maybe it is a separate nonprofit that you're creating where you can have some grants be paid back and forth from another exempt organization to the church, or the church has some say or leadership decisions in, but you're describing a commercial kitchen, and let's say you've got a commercial kitchen that is going to be renting out to people that really couldn't find a space otherwise. They are kind of in that very beginning stage of trying to start a business. That can be inherently an exempt source of revenue if it's not necessarily in the church. So, by creating a separate not-for-profit, you could allow yourself to do a lot of other activities like, housing development, low-income housing development. That's outside of the purview of the church, but maybe you could create a new not-for-profit to do some activities like that if there's a need in the community. So there are kind of other ways to structure it other than just housing everything under the church umbrella. A lot of churches that I find that are really successful have the church exempt entity and then have created some other not-for-profits that they're affiliated with or have control over, but they are separate from the church itself.
That was a question I had actually, and that's a great example there. When is it best for churches to consider launching projects directly, themselves, and when might it be best to create subsidiary entities? Are there sort of rules of thumb for that, or kind of like guidelines of when to think about separate entities and when it works fine or well, or what not to do it on their own directly?
I sometimes feel like it's like if you ask, does this relate to our mission? And let's say the answer is no, it doesn't relate to our mission. It's not inherently something religious, but we do have this need in the community to create low-income housing, and we have the funds and ability to get this off the ground and start a new entity, which might be considered taxable in the church sector, but in a different not-for-profit, if set up correctly, is all it's related to that new entity's mission, not necessarily our church mission, but to create new low-income housing. And I also think sometimes different not-for-profits can generate grant funding maybe a little bit easier than a religious organization can. Open themselves up to things like government grant funding, especially if you were going to do low-income housing. You possibly could get some HUD funding or something like that, or even other community funding where they're not going to necessarily give to a religious organization, but they would give to a separate not-for-profit.
Separate incorporation can also provide some measure of protection if the assets are separated from each other. How valuable that is just going to depend on the assets you have, what's going on, and what the separation there is, whether it's totally separately governed or how that's operating.
Most of the churches we work with in our Partners in Vision program, where we help churches with large and or complex real estate projects like affordable housing or other community development purposes. When we work with the church, most of them, if not all of them, we advise to set up a separate nonprofit for those activities. Because as Amanda said, there are some foundations that state in their guidelines, we do not lend to religious organizations. So you might, all the things you do in your church might be some of the things they would fund otherwise if you weren't a church. So it's really about understanding that, we're in a more complex era for churches. And in order to advance the mission of the church, we've got to become a little bit more sophisticated and aware of the ways to do things to accomplish the same goals that maybe we had in a different time, but it's a different time. So we have to do it differently.
Oh, it sounds like this connects a little bit back to, Amanda, your comment earlier on about the sort of three buckets, the related, the exempt, and the unrelated. And that there's a way in which sort of, maybe this is, I'm going to test this idea out because maybe I'm wrong about this, but that there's possibly a way in which activities the church might engage in are kind of that way, both financially, but also from a mission perspective. So there's things that are very related to the mission of the organization, which could just sit within the church and they could generate revenue for the church. They're very, very related and aligned. And then there's things on the other end of the spectrum that are like just not related, and they never will be. And it doesn't matter whether you set up a separate organization or not, they're not going to be. Like an example, I think that is probably in this space is like renting a cell phone tower space on a church, which a lot of churches do, right? So generates some great revenue, takes up almost no space, has almost no impact negatively, except it's really unrelated. And it doesn't matter if you made some kind of separate nonprofit. Providing 5 bars of cell service is probably not in any way related to the mission of the church, but it can generate some revenue, and so you just pay the unrelated business income tax on it. And then there's this stuff in the middle that's like things that the church's mission directly maybe doesn't quite fit, but they're still really vital community services and community-oriented programming. And that's where creating another nonprofit to provide those and run those that somehow interfaces with the church might make a lot of sense. And that separate nonprofit can run and operate that venture and generate revenue. And the church can still bring in some perhaps lease or rental income from that. Is that correct?
That is kind of correct. Like you see churches do this with nursing homes. You do see them creating separate entities to have a daycare. Where you're still accomplishing the mission of the church, but it just is better housed someplace else. And yes, the examples you gave are really good examples of that. I think, like let's talk about parking lot rental for an example, because this can give inherently, if you're renting out space in a parking lot, it's unrelated to an organization. That's just under the code. But let's say you are in like a college city and it's game day on Saturday and you're going to let people park in your parking lot, right? But there's going to be a volunteer, not anyone that's compensated by the church, but just some volunteers that come out that are collecting money. And at the end of the day, they make a donation back from the church. You've taken an unrelated business income source, and because of a volunteer exemption, you've moved it into an excluded category. And actually it ends up kind of being picked up contribution on your books. So it's important to kind of get the set of circumstances correct and do the analysis of income beforehand to make correct decisions. And one thing we do have some people that on the call today that are involved in your, investments and funds and stuff like that. One thing I would like to caution people about is, let's say you've got a lot of extra cash reserves that are laying around, and you're thinking about investing those funds in different financial vehicles. One of the cautions that I would say is make sure that you're investing in something that's going to create excluded income for you. That's not publicly traded partnership, where now you've opened yourself up to taxation because of investments that you hold, as well as opened yourself up to tax filings in all 50 states, let's say, because, the wrong investment advice or investing in the wrong kind of vehicle can have lots of tax implications very quickly. And, when you asked about some mistakes that people have made in the past, it wasn't even like religious organizations that this is an example of, but, I had a not-for-profit that invested in a baking company to just kind of generate some unrestricted funds, and they were happy to pay the 21% tax. What they didn't realize is that bakery operated in 15 states. And so then they had to pay, and file tax returns in 15 different states. It gets complex very quickly.
I think that's a very interesting little tidbit about investment choices and taxation.
You can invest in lots of vehicles that give you all excluded income sources, and they're great. You can invest in some not so great vehicles too. So
what I'm hearing is a theme over and over again here is a couple things. One, the specifics of a situation really, really matter when it comes to taxation. Like the really detailed specifics of it. I mean, tiny details in the way things are done, structured, written, everything else can make a
and we
massive
need the whole story, not just like if there are 10 steps to something, you can't give us 5. We need 10 to give you good advice.
Yeah. So that's critical, right? And then related to that, of course, is this need for expert help, which we have said many times and hasn't been heard yet on this call. That is a theme for sure. So what advice do you give people in finding expert help? Like what should church leaders be looking for in selecting legal and accounting support for this sort of issue in particular?
Well, I was going to say, just finding expert help. I was going to say, if you need help with your church building projects, you would reach out to Church Building and Loan Fund. But I mean, it's common. Some of it is common sense. If it's about taxes, you need an accountant or a tax attorney, a CPA or a tax attorney. If you need plumbing work, you call a plumber. If you need electrical work, you call an electrician. I think it was Heather who might have said it. Churches are very good at do-it-yourself or getting people to volunteer. This is probably not one of those times where you want to try to get volunteers from the church. This is where you need expert help, and knowing that is if everybody's saying the same thing about something, if you can't do that because it'll generate taxes. That's probably when you need to ask somebody who knows for sure.
Yeah. As far as legal assistance, I really encourage folks to contact their local bar association. Almost every local bar association is going to have a roster of attorneys with their specialties, and you're going to ask for someone who has experience in nonprofit corporate law. And that's really important because the nonprofit aspect is different. It's easier than just asking around. Right? You might know somebody who is in the nonprofit world, and that's great if you can do that. But you're just asking around, you're going to get, sort of like personal injury attorneys and people who sort of dabble and that sort of thing. And the great thing about contacting your local bar association is usually they have agreements with those attorneys that they'll talk for, 30 minutes for free, for a first consultation or something like that. So you might even be able to get your question answered and not have to go any further.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of back to Susan's comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to second what Heather said. Like, you don't want to talk to a corporate tax person about profit tax issue, because all of us know enough to be dangerous in areas, but you really want to talk to, you wouldn't ask a brain surgeon to do your heart surgery. So make sure you are talking to the correct person.
And as Susan noted earlier, not necessarily just someone in your congregation. Maybe
Yes.
they know somebody, but just relying on the lawyer in your congregation to answer all those questions is not likely to be a good solution. I know in my social enterprise that I run, I typically in a typical year have 5 different law firms that I'm working with on different aspects of what we do. HR law is very different from property tax law, which is very different from bond, financing law. They're all very different. And so, you do need that expertise in those specific areas, especially the more complex a project gets and the weightier it gets. That's really, really important.
Yes. I don't think we can emphasize enough. Go to the local bar association. Do not Google.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, right? To seek that out. Well, this has been a great conversation. This is just sort of an introductory taste. I mean, our hope is that folks just begin to get a feel for the sorts of issues, the sorts of questions to be asking. Patrick and Susan have offered themselves to support congregations looking to do development and looking to do different enterprises, and they do some great work. Amanda has a team of folks that she's a part of that can provide some assistance. Heather is an expert from the UCC Church. Rooted Good, my organization, we are actually putting together a decision tree tax guide resource to provide sort of some of this content in the form of a kind of a visual document to help people think about the different aspects that they need to consider. That should be available at rootedgood.org fairly soon. And so we thank you all for the time you've given today and your expertise. Are there any closing comments before we finish? I want to make sure we don't miss anything really key piece of information.
Yeah, I have just a couple of thoughts. I just want to emphasize, churches, don't ignore your bylaws when you are talking about doing these projects. So make sure that you're in compliance with your bylaws, and in connection with that, make sure that church council members are aware of their fiduciary duties with respect to the church when they're making these decisions. They need to be in the best interest of the church. It can be really easy to get excited about, the project, but we always want to make sure that we're operating in the best interest of the church. So just keep that in mind.
One of the things I've also seen happen, and this happens in partnerships with developers, this happens in relationship with, vendors or whatnot, is there's a tendency for the sake of saving money or expediency to just accept the contracts that are given by outside parties to the church. And again, same theme, don't do that. Hire your own legal counsel, recognizing that those relationships, while they can be very positive, there's always some element of different incentives at play for the different players in a system, right? And so for the church to exercise its own fiduciary responsibility for itself and to not just be taken advantage of, frankly, it's really important to kind of have your own review of that stuff and not just to accept what's given by somebody else. As well-meaning as they might be, they have their own interests at heart, and the church needs to have its interests at heart as well. So that's a great reminder, Heather. Thanks.
Yes.
I would just say, don't be afraid to think outside of the box and to, engage with trying something new, and at least think about it and plan for it. Don't let the complexity of it stop you, because there are folks who will help, and it's probably not as expensive as you think. So I would just say, be courageous in terms of taking on these ideas, new ways of being church, and then you can figure out the important things to keep you out of trouble as you go.
Yeah, there's almost always a way to make something work. If you've got the vision for it, if you got the idea for it, there's almost always a way to make it work. Yep.
That's true.
Well, great. Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.